At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. The plasma bolt fused ochre dust into glass. For Commander Sal, it was the last beautiful thing she saw. For a split second before the shockwave hit, a perfect circle of black glass materialized on the valley floor, a dark mirror for a sky choked with smoke. Then a concussive roar, and the shriek of tearing metal dissolved the world as another plasma bolt atomized one of her skimmers. Inside her command vehicle, the air was heavy with the sharp scent of superheated metal and burnt insulators. The low hum of the life support system sounded like a funeral dirge. Sal gripped the navigation console, her long, elegant, four-fingered hands leaving pale prints on the dark metal. The main viewer displayed a 30-meter Hessian war walker, a monument to brutalist architecture and functional ugliness, as it raised a hydraulic hammer the size of a shuttle. Every line of the machine spoke of crushing, a total rejection of grace. It brought the hammer down with contemptuous ease and smashed a civilian transport that had fallen behind the convoy. The vehicle, once a graceful expression of lumen design, flattened into a twisted, burning ruin. The comms channel dissolved into a cacophony of final curses and static-laced screams, then cut to dead air. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise. Sal's jaw locked so tight a spike of pain shot through her molars. Her people built their defenses around their glorious citadels, their towering spires woven from living metal and bone struts that shifted from pearly white to soft rose in the light. They believed their beauty alone was a deterrent. The Hessians simply hammered the walls down. Now the Hessians herded her convoy, the lost organized remnant of the Lumen Defense Force and the fleeing civilian council, through the Great Weaver's Valley, slaughtering them systematically from a distance. Another walker pivoted its blocky torso on thick, piston-driven legs and fixed its single malevolent red optic on her skimmer. The high-pitched whine of its primary plasma cannon charging became the soundtrack to her world's end. She closed her large, dark eyes, her smooth, gray features settling into a rigid shape of bitter acceptance. Her military doctrine, her culture's whole approach to conflict, amounted to a fragile, beautiful vase. The Hessians brought a hammer. They studied war as a philosophical exercise, a clash of strategies as elegant as a master's tapestry. The Hessians studied war as applied physics. Overwhelming force equals victory. Their logic proved distressingly effective. "All is lost," she whispered to the ghosts on the comms. The words felt like swallowing dust. An atmospheric shriek pierced the din of battle. The sound was the tortured scream of emergency braking thrusters pushed to maximum overload. Sal's eyes opened. A blazing object streaked down from the upper atmosphere, its ablative shielding boiling away in a teardrop of fire. The object's size and speed ruled out a Hessian warship, its deliberate path a meteor. This was an arrival, not an orbital strike, a very angry arrival. It executed a brutal litho-braking maneuver. It skipped off a high ridge, then plowed into the rocky cliffs that overlooked the valley. The impact produced a deafening groan of stressed metal and the final explosive roar of a dying engine. The pod gouged a 100-meter trench in the cliff base and stopped violently, throwing a cloud of pulverized rock and ochre dust into the air. The ground shook, and for a moment, the universe became that single deafening impact. Emergency heat vents hissed and poured distorting waves of superheated gas into the air around the half-buried craft. Then a voice crackled to life. It broadcast on a broad-spectrum emergency channel that cut through the chaos. The clipped, clear voice spoke a brutally functional version of standardized galactic trade tongue. "Broadcasting on all active frequencies. This is Human Catalyst Team Kindling. We are on the ground. You have hostiles closing on your 6. Advise you find a hole and pull it in after you. We'll keep them busy." Sal stared at the comm unit as if it had just cursed her ancestors. One of her aides, a young officer named Liren, His face a canvas of terror, pointed a trembling finger at the smoking wreck on the cliffs. His voice was a choked mix of disbelief and something she hadn't heard in weeks, a sliver of absurd expectation.
"Commander, a drop pod! A human drop pod!"
The words felt like both prayer and curse. The humans, the infamous Deathworlders from the gravity well hell called Earth, the allies who had remained silent for so long while her world burned. The Hessian walkers, their machine logic momentarily disrupted by this new, unclassified variable, hesitated. Their massive torsos pivoted. Targeting sensors swept the dust cloud to quantify the threat. A percussive thump blew a reinforced metallic door outward from the smoke and settling dust. It landed 20 meters away with a clang that echoed across the valley. The frame was too warped to open any other way. 4 figures emerged, silhouetted against the distorting heat from the vents. They were small, brutally compact compared to the tall, slender lumen. They moved with a low, predatory purpose, their bodies built for stability over elegance. They hauled heavy packs and coils of dark rope, their movements spare and sure despite the violence of their arrival. They completely ignored the 30-meter god machines in the valley below, their attention focused entirely on their gear as if they unpacked for a camping trip.
"Get me over there!"
Sal snapped at her pilot. The skimmer banked hard, its anti-grav engines kicking up a fresh storm of dust as it settled near the human pod. She stumbled out before the ramp fully lowered, her uniform torn, her face gaunt with fury and sleeplessness. The air here was hot and smelled of burnt rock and superheated air that carried a faint metallic taste.
4!
She spat, the word tasting like ash. She walked towards the lead human. He calmly checked the tension on a simple leather sling.
"After our cities burned, after our armies were broken, the Great Human Federation sends 4 soldiers?"
She gestured wildly at the nearest warwalker, which had resumed its advance.
"What are you meant to do? Write a strongly worded report? This is an insult, not a rescue!"
The lead human, Ibn, finished checking the load in his sling. A heavy, fist-sized rock rested in its cradle. He ignored the walker. He ignored his team. He looked from Sal's desperate, enraged face to her trembling hands, then back to her eyes. A thin, dangerous grin split his dust-caked features. The smile held no friendship, only the predatory glee of a wolf that had just spotted a particularly stupid sheep. "Commander," he said, his voice a low gravel, calm amidst the chaos. "The rescue fleet is 6 weeks out, best case. We're the appetizer." He hefted the rock in his sling. "And as for your other question, 4 is enough." An hour later, they were hidden. The human team, moving with an instinct for terrain that bordered on supernatural, guided the lumen remnants into a network of caves, a former sculptor's warren carved deep into the cliffside. The cool air smelled of damp stone and ancient dust, a welcome relief from the battlefield outside, where the Hessians now glossed the abandoned convoy, one vehicle at a time. Sal stood before a flickering hollow map projected onto a flat cave wall. Her voice was a strained monotone, the sound of a commander reciting an obituary for her own army.
"Their forward lines are anchored by 12 Goliath-class warwalkers. Armor is a triple-layer composite, proof against anything short of a capital ship's main gun. We have no viable anti-armor assets remaining."
She pointed to a winding canyon on the map.
"And here, the glass ravine, a place of great beauty and greater danger. Its walls are unstable quartz. Our own laws forbid passage with any heavy vehicle. The Hessians have avoided it."
The 4 humans listened with an unnerving stillness. Ibn, the leader, leaned against a rock, arms crossed. Maris, the team's ecologist, crumbled a piece of local soil between her fingers. Roger, the demolitionist, sharpened a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shik-shik a counterpoint to Sal's voice. Tala, the medic, checked the seals on her medkit one by one. When Sal finished, she expected questions about force disposition, patrol routes, or counter-battery fire procedures. Instead, Ibn pushed himself off the wall and pointed a grimy finger at a series of ridges. "These ridges," he said, his voice flat. "What's the rock type? Igneous? Sedimentary? What's its shear strength?"
Saul stared. "That information is absent from the military database."
Maris spoke without looking up.
"Any geothermal vents in this range? High sulfur compounds in the local flora? I'm smelling something interesting in the soil."
Roger paused his sharpening and held up a jagged piece of metal he'd scavenged from a destroyed skimmer. "Lumen alloy. What's its work-hardening coefficient?" Tala finally looked up from her kit, her eyes direct.
"What are the most direct battlefield injuries your people have sustained? Plasma burns? Kinetic trauma? I need to know what I'm patching."
A surge of incandescent frustration filled Sal. They ignored her meticulously gathered military intelligence her people had died for, to ask about geology, gardening, metallurgy, and medicine.
"Those details are irrelevant,"
she snapped, her voice echoing in the cavern.
"A war walker is bearing down on us, and you want to discuss rocks and roots?"
Ibn shook his head slowly, his gaze unwavering. He walked to the map and wiped away the glowing tactical symbols with the back of his hand. "Commander, you are still thinking like a soldier. You are focused on their army. We're focused on making their stay so profoundly unpleasant they pack up and leave." He tapped the bare rock of the cave wall. "The Hessians are fighting a war. We're about to start a hunt. And the hunter knows his terrain." That night, under the pale double moonlight of her homeworld, Sal learned what he meant. She and Tolan, a young civilian engineer who had managed to save a cache of geological survey drones, watched a live feed huddled in the cave entrance. On the screen, two small figures, Ibn and Roger, ascended a cliff face that lumen records marked simply as unclimbable. They used no anti-grav tech, no thruster packs, just the rhythmic, metallic tink, tink, tink of pitons driven into rock. The whisper of rope paid out, and the occasional grunt of exertion carried on the wind. They moved with a terrifying vertical grace, a synergy that spoke of 1,000 such climbs. They flowed up the cliff, becoming part of the rock. They were predators, taking the high ground. Near the top, a small rock slide, dislodged by Roger's boot, tumbled down. Sal flinched, but the two humans barely reacted, clinging to the rock face like lichens. The drone's enhanced optical feed showed that Roger's gloved hands were raw and bleeding from the abrasive, quartz-laced rock. He ignored it, his entire being focused on finding the next hold. This display of physical endurance was both horrifying and awe-inspiring. Her people, with their slender frames and lighter gravity evolution, would need harnesses and automated winches to ascend a tenth of this height safely. These creatures, these humans, were simply built differently. They were forged in a world that demanded such hardness, a world that killed you for a moment's inattention.
"They're bones,"
Tolan whispered, his eyes wide at a biometric overlay from the drone.
"Their bone density is almost triple our own. Their muscle fibers are thicker, more tightly packed. How can any species evolve like this?" "They call their world a death world," Sal murmured, her gaze fixed on the screen. "I'm beginning to understand why."
They were monsters who happened to be soldiers. And for the first time in a long time, Sal was profoundly grateful they were on her side. At dawn, the team was in position. From their perch on the unclimbable cliff, the valley floor looked like a tactical map laid out for inspection. A lone Hessian walker, a scout, patrolled below. It moved with the arrogant confidence of an apex predator in a land with no challengers, its heavy footfalls echoing in the morning stillness. In their makeshift nest, Roger carefully uncased a small, dense cylinder from his pack, one of his few remaining military-grade shaped charges. He handled it with the reverence of a priest with a holy relic. He prepared to pack it into a ceremonial lumen burial urn, one of a dozen they retrieved from a sealed tomb the night before. Tolan guided them, his features a study in sorrow as they violated the sacred space. The urns were made of vitrified ceramic, a material fired in a volcano's heart and said to last an eternity. It was also, as Roger confirmed by testing a shard, non-reactive and incredibly heat-resistant. "The physics are simple," Roger muttered to Ibn, his voice a low rasp as he lined the urn with a thin layer of ablative paste. "You don't need a bigger hammer, you need a better nail. Focus the blast, turn a firecracker into a needle." Ibn ignored the technical details. His eyes were on the walker's patrol pattern. He licked a finger and held it to the wind, his expression as calm as if he were about to throw a stone into a pond. He'd spent the last hour observing, timing the walker's movements, its pauses, the predictable sweep of its optical sensor. "It favors its right leg on the turn," he said. "Puts all its weight on the joint for a half second. Give me a 10-second lead on its next 90-degree pivot." Taking the modified urn from Roger, his movements spare and sure, Ibn carefully loaded it into the catapult's cradle. The weapon was a crude, ugly thing, assembled from scavenged skimmer parts and high-tensile vine reeds, but it had a brutal, undeniable purpose. "Ready," Roger grunted, his eyes also locked on the walker. 3, 2, 1, fire, Ibn said, his voice level. He yanked the release lever. The catapult arm snapped forward with a deep thwump. The urn sailed into the air, a silent, graceful arc against the pale morning sky. For a long, heart-stopping moment, it looked like it would miss, sailing wide. Sal held her breath as she watched the drone feed from the cave. Then gravity took over. The urn's trajectory curved perfectly. It smashed directly onto the walker's massive, heavily armored knee joint with a sound no louder than pottery breaking. The explosion was shockingly small, a muffled thump, barely audible over the walker's own engine noise, a tiny puff of smoke. But the shaped charge did its work. A jet of superheated plasma and molten copper, focused to a microscopic point by the concave lining of the charge, punched through the armor like a hot needle through wax. It vaporized the primary hydraulic piston within the joint in a millisecond. For a second, nothing happened. The walker continued its turn. Then it tried to take its next step. The joint failed. With a deafening shriek of tortured metal that echoed for miles, the multi-ton leg buckled. The machine lurched, its own immense momentum suddenly becoming its enemy. It toppled sideways, crashing to the valley floor with a force that shook the cliffs the humans stood on. Dust and debris erupted from the impact site. The giant, for the first time, was silent. In the caves below, the assembled lumen stared at the drone feed, stunned into absolute silence. Then a single tentative cheer broke the quiet. It was Tollin. The sound spread like a contagion, a wave of explosive, disbelieving joy. Up on the cliff, Ibn already scanned the horizon for the inevitable response team. "One down," he said, turning to Roger. "Now we go and annoy the neighbors." The Hessians' arrogance was a resource more valuable than any weapon. Their forward repair and refueling depot was a hastily constructed mess of prefabricated shelters and stacked supplies, thrown up in a small canyon with the blatant assumption that no meaningful resistance remained. Roger noted the sloppy patrol routes, the exposed fuel conduits, and the single, lazy sentry drone with the quiet contempt of a master craftsman observing shoddy work. The valuable components, spare actuator joints for the walkers, delicate power converters, were stacked on open-air pallets under simple thermal tarps. It was an invitation. That night, with Tala providing overwatch from a high ridge with a high-powered scope, her calm voice occasionally reporting patrol movements in his earpiece, Roger moved through the depot like a ghost. He wore a dark, non-reflective suit, his movements fluid and silent. Big, spectacular explosions were for amateurs and Hessians. Roger worked like an artist, and his medium was chaos. He placed small charges, each no bigger than his thumb, with minute, deliberate movements. One on a primary fuel pump, tucked away from view. Another slipped into the cooling fins of a stacked fusion core awaiting installation. A few more, looking like simple magnetic clamps, on the delicate knee joints of the spare walker legs on the pallets. He even found the main comms uplink and attached a tiny charge to the primary data cable. He was in and out in 20 minutes, a whisper in the dark. He was a full kilometer away, back in the rocks with Tala, when the first charge went off, triggered by a simple delayed detonator. The fuel pump seized, then ruptured, spewing flammable plasma coolant over the supply pallets. A second charge, timed 30 seconds later, ignited the pool of coolant. The fire was sudden and intensely hot. This triggered thermal alarms, which in turn activated the fire suppression system. Unfortunately for the Hessians, Roger had placed a third charge on the main water pipe for the suppression system. It blew a neat hole in the pipe 100 meters from the depot, creating a lovely but entirely useless geyser in the desert. The heat from the fire caused the unsecured fusion core to overheat. Its containment field failed, and it detonated, unleashing a massive electromagnetic pulse. The pulse fried every unsecured electronic system in a 200-meter radius, including the sentry drone and the depot's control systems. The final charges on the spare walker legs went off in the confusion, subtly warping the delicate joints and rendering them into multi-ton paperweights. The result? A symphony of systemic collapse. The Hessians lost more combat readiness from a handful of tiny bombs than they had in the last major battle against the entire Lumen army. On the ridge, Tala lowered her scope.
"Messy,"
she commented, a hint of admiration in her voice. Roger just grunted, already cleaning his tools. The job was done. Overlord Baldasser's command deck, aboard his orbiting dreadnought, was a chamber of polished chrome and black volcanic glass. A deep tremor in his jaw was the only sign of his rage. The reports scrolling on his main holo display made no sense. A Goliath-class walker, disabled by what the initial panicked report called a geological event. A forward depot crippled by what the follow-up analysis labeled multiple simultaneous catastrophic minor system failures. Gibberish. He brought up the forensic analysis from the downed walker. A young, nervous Hessian tech analyst stood before him, his broad shoulders slumped in apprehension.
"My lord,"
the analyst stammered, avoiding eye contact with the massive, leather-skinned warlord.
"the trajectory analysis of the impactor shows a high-arc, non-ballistic path, a guided or thrown object, and the damage, a focused thermal jet, likely from a shaped charge, pierced the joint casing from above. We found traces of copper fused into the alloy."
Baldasser stared at the glowing lines of the trajectory analysis on the display. His mind raced. A targeted strike. From above. Guided. He pulled up the cultural file on the lumen. He saw images of their delicate sculptures, their graceful four-fingered hands. "These creatures couldn't guide a shuttle out of a hangar," he muttered. "This is beyond them." He turned on his security chief, his eyes blazing with paranoid certainty. "This is an inside job. Someone in our logistics chain is a traitor, feeding targeting data to a hidden Lumen heavy weapon we missed. Find them, tear them apart. I want a name." He dismissed the analyst with a wave. "And get this ridiculous theory about thrown pottery off my screen." He reached the wrong conclusion, but his arrogance could accept it. The thought that these artisans outsmarted him was unthinkable. The thought that he had traitors in his ranks was, to a mind like his, merely business as usual. Ibn gathered a group of 20 Lumen civilians in a large, well-lit cavern. Tolan, the engineer, stood among them. Ibn held up his simple leather sling. He demonstrated the motion, a smooth two-part whirl to build momentum, followed by a whip-like snap of the wrist to release the stone. He sent a rock skipping across the cavern floor, where it hit the far wall with a surprisingly loud crack. He handed out similar slings. The results were pathetic. Stones flopped to the ground. Others flew backwards. Their hands, built for fine, controlled movements, struggled with the explosive power the weapon required.
"This is useless,"
One of them, a master sculptor, muttered, dropping his sling in disgust. "Our hands are made for creating, a purpose alien to this brutality." Ibn picked up the discarded sling. "Tolan," he said, "show me how you weave." Tolan, eager for familiar ground, picked up a small portable loom. His hands moved with startling speed, the shuttle a flicker between the threads in a dance of controlled force and release. Ibn pointed to Tolan's wrist. "There, that snap. The controlled release of tension. It's the same motion." He held up the sling. "This is a tool of finesse. It's about a controlled release of tension. Think of it as an instrument. You are weaving the stone through the air." The concept clicked. A murmur of understanding went through the group. They picked up their slings again, this time as artisans learning a new craft. For the next 3 days, the caverns echoed with the whistle of slings and the thud of stones against padded targets. They progressed slowly, with much frustration. Hands accustomed to the delicate dance of the loom were bruised and blistered. But Ibn was a relentless teacher, and the lumen were desperate students. They began to innovate, weaving new slings from a composite of vine reeds and metallic threads. These new weapons were lighter, stronger, and far more accurate. In learning to fight, they wove war into the fabric of their culture. While the slingers trained, Maris led Tolan through a blackened field that had once been a hidden lumen farm. Tolan mourned the loss of heirloom seed strains. Maris, however, got on her hands and knees in the dirt, her eyes scanning the ground with fierce intensity. She carefully gathered the few surviving seeds.
"A library of burned books is a tragedy," she told Talon, her voice rough. "A field of burned seeds is a temporary problem. The information is still in there."
She led him to a damp, cool cave where she had set up a makeshift lab. 3 days prior, she mashed native starchy tubers into a pulp and added a packet of aggressive earth-born yeast. Now a steady stream of bubbles escaped the airlock on the large ceramic pot. The mash fermented into a high-proof alcohol.
"The soil provides,"
she said, tapping the pot.
"Today it gives us fuel for incendiaries, but tomorrow, after the Hessians are gone—"
She held up a single tiny seed between her thumb and forefinger.
"It will give you bread."
Tolan watched the bubbles rise, a symbol of life persisting in the dark. He understood. True survival came from protecting the potential for a new harvest, not from hiding scrolls in a cave. The constant pinprick attacks finally drove Overlord Baldassir to madness. Annoyed and impatient, he dispatched a squadron of 3 hunter mechs, smaller, more agile machines than the Goliath walkers, designed for scouting and anti-infantry operations. They were faster, quieter, and equipped with rapid-fire plasma repeaters and advanced sensor suites. Their mission was simple: sweep the foothills, find the source of the disruptions, and eradicate the vermin responsible. Baldassir saw this as a simple extermination mission. He failed to realize he was sending his trained hunting dogs into a trap set by true predators. Ibn and Sal used the Hunter Squadron's approach as a live-fire final exam for the now-capable Lumen slingers. They chose their ground with meticulous care, a narrow rocky pass filled with house-sized boulders and natural choke points, a place where the Hunter's speed would be useless. When the 3 mechs entered the pass in single file, the attack came, sudden, silent, and overwhelming. From all sides, a coordinated storm of stones erupted. The Lumen, armed with their master-crafted composite slings, ignored the thick torso armor. Ibn drilled them relentlessly on one target only. They aimed for the optics. Dozens of heavy, sharpened stones slammed into the red sensor eyes of the mechs. The sound was like a shower of heavy gravel on a reinforced window. The armored glass crazed, then shattered. Blinded and disoriented, the machines fired their plasma repeaters wildly, brilliant bolts of energy searing black scars across the rock walls. As they stumbled, Roger and Tala, positioned on the cliffs above, triggered a series of small explosive charges. The blasts triggered small rock slides, carefully calculated to herd the blinded machines into prepared deadfalls and tripwires made of high-tensile vines. One hunter, staggering forward blindly, caught its foot in a vine snare and toppled face first into a deep crevice. The second was disabled when a volley of aimed rocks jammed its hip actuators, causing it to seize up. The third came down under a concentrated volley of the new incendiary pots, filled with Maris's potent biofuel. They shattered against its torso, bathing the machine in flaming liquid that overwhelmed its heat sinks and caused a systemic failure in its power systems. The victory came with decisive brutality, but it was messy. In the chaos, one of the lumen slingers, a young weaver who had been too slow to find cover, was cut down by a burst of wild plasma fire. Sal stood over the body, her face grim. The joy of their first real victory was tempered by the truth of this new way of war. It was brutal. It was intimate. She knew the weaver's name. But as she looked at the burning wreckage of the hunter mech, and then at the soot-streaked faces of her remaining slingers, she knew it was also necessary. The loss of his elite hunter squadron was the final humiliation. Baldassare stood on his command deck, a vein pulsing visibly in his thick temple. Ghosts and artisans armed with rocks were systematically dismantling his legend. Then a secure comms channel opened. A private message from Warlord Killian, his chief political rival back in the Hessian Dominion. The message was short, the text dripping with condescending pity. "Having trouble with the local fauna, Baldassare? Don't worry. I'm sure your legacy can withstand one minor setback. The Dominion values tenacity, after all. To a point." The message was a poisoned dagger. Failure here meant more than a military defeat. It was political suicide. Fueled by a potent cocktail of rage and fear, Baldassare made a fatal decision. He abandoned all pretense of tactics. He brought up a map of the region, located the last known lumen sanctuary, the hidden mountain city of Spirefall, and drew a single brutal line towards it. He strode to the master command console. "All units," he boomed, his voice shaking the deck plates. "General advance. March on Spirefall. All walkers, all support elements. The time for outmaneuvering them is over. The time for rooting them out is over. Grind that mountain to dust. Erase this entire pathetic species, their pet humans, and my own humiliation from existence." A lone lumen scout drone relayed the terrifying news. Baldassare's entire remaining column, over a dozen Goliath walkers and their support elements, marching in a slow-moving line of steel and death. A grim silence fell over the assembled lumen and humans in the main cave. They were out of time, out of military-grade explosives, and out of room to run. Ibn unrolled his hard-copy geological map. His finger traced the path of the Hessian advance towards the hidden city. "There's only one way his column can approach the city with any speed," he said, his voice low and steady. He tapped the winding canyon Sal had pointed out days before. "The glass ravine." Talon nodded grimly. "Structurally unsound. Dangerous." Ibn looked up from the map, his eyes flinty and glinting. "Unsound is good," he said. "Dangerous is better." A plan formed in the silence, an idea so audacious and desperate it bordered on madness, an all-or-nothing gamble. "We're burying his army," Ibn said, looking at the faces around him. Sal looked at the faces of her people, at the weavers and engineers who had become hardened soldiers. She looked at the 4 Deathworlders who had turned her world upside down. Her entire life had been about structured, honorable battle. This was something else entirely. Primal. Survival. She gave a single, sharp nod, her decision made.
"We do it your way."
The 24 hours before the battle were a blur of frantic, focused activity. The entire surviving lumen population mobilized. There were no more civilians. The division between human expertise and lumen skill vanished, replaced by a seamless, desperate collaboration. High on the glittering walls of the glass ravine, Tala and Roger led teams of the most agile lumen. Using climbing skills honed by generations of mountain sculptors, they helped Roger place his last precious explosive charges at key structural fault lines, every charge a deliberate cut designed to sever the canyon's keystone points. Below, in a series of hidden caves, Maris and Tollin oversaw an assembly line. They poured biofuel into the aerodynamically shaped ceramic urns, etched with patterns that served as both cultural defiance and aerodynamic stabilizers. Sal, now a true guerrilla commander, moved between the groups. Her voice, once brittle with despair, was now sharp and clear with command. She positioned her teams of slingers along the canyon rim, drilling them on firing cues and turning the beautiful, dangerous ravine into a 360-degree kill box. The air was thick with the acrid smell of the explosive's chemical components, the sweet, yeasty scent of fermenting biofuel, and a charged quiet that settled over the workers. Every glance was quick, every word spoken was low and clipped. At dawn, the rumble began. It was a low, seismic vibration felt through the soles of their feet long before the Hessian column was visible. Sal took to her command skimmer, leading a small, sacrificial squadron of the last 4 operational lumen vehicles. They flew out to meet the column, a pitiful show of defiance against the line of marching titans. They fired their weak plasma weapons, the bolts splashing like harmless blue paint against the walkers' thick armor. The pathetic display was exactly what Baldassare expected. On the command deck of his personal Goliath, he watched the scene on his main viewer and laughed. "Pathetic," he boomed over the command channel. "Run them down! I want their commander's vehicle for a footstool!" As his walkers surged forward, Sal's squadron executed a disciplined, calculated retreat, straight towards the inviting mouth of the glass ravine. Baldassare, blinded by arrogance and desperate for final crushing victory, took the bait. He ordered his entire column to pursue at full speed, eager to personally crush Sal's skimmer under his walker's massive steel heel. The trap was set. The lead Hessian walkers stomped into the narrow confines of the glass ravine. Their massive forms scraped against the quartz walls, sending showers of glittering shards down onto their armored hulls. The morning light refracted through the quartz, bathing the brutal war machines in an eerie rainbow-hued glow. Ibn, watching from a high command post with a pair of magnoculars, felt the ground tremble with their passage. He took a deep, steadying breath. He keyed his calm, his voice perfectly calm. "Roger, now." A series of sharp cracks echoed through the canyon, the surgical snap of Roger's chargers severing key fault lines deep within the rock, a sound more akin to a whip than a bomb. For a single, agonizing heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the entire canyon seemed to groan. High above, massive overhangs of quartz, their foundations severed, began to shift. The mountain was letting go. An avalanche of stone, thousands upon thousands of tons of it, rained down. It obliterated the front and rear of the column, sealing the ravine like a tomb. Walkers were crushed instantly, their thick armor crumbling like paper. Others were simply buried, their red optics flickering out one by one under a mountain of glittering, shattered rock. The Hessian column dissolved into chaos. Trapped, blind, and crippled, they were now targets in a shooting gallery. From the rim above, a storm erupted. On Sal's command, hundreds of lumen slingers stood and unleashed a perfectly coordinated barrage. Incendiary urns shattered against walker hulls, bathing them in flaming biofuel. Shrapnel bombs peppered their sensor arrays, blinding any machine that still had functioning optics. The walkers, now firing wildly, stumbled into each other in the confined space. The ravine became a hell of fire, smoke, and shrieking metal. Baldassare's command walker, one of the few still functional, remained trapped. He watched on his auxiliary cameras in stunned disbelief as his invincible war machines were dismantled piece by piece by rocks and fire. A heavy, stone-filled urn, flung by a weaver with a master's touch, arced high through the smoky air. It flew with uncanny accuracy, smashing directly into his cockpit's armored canopy. It failed to penetrate, but a network of spiderweb cracks erupted across the viewport. Through the cracks, he could see them, the tiny, slender figures on the cliffs above, standing resolute against the fire and smoke, their slings whirring. He finally understood. His mind, so clouded by arrogance, was suddenly terribly clear. A mountain had defeated him. A people he dismissed as fragile artists had defeated him. A handful of Deathworlders who taught the Weavers how to turn their entire world into a weapon had defeated him. Humiliated, beaten, and trapped, he gave the order he never thought he would utter, his voice a choked whisper.
All remaining units, retreat! Full retreat!
The battle ended. The Gloss Ravine, once a place of dangerous beauty, was now a smoldering graveyard of Hessian steel, a permanent monument to their arrogance. As the survivors of the human and lumen force gathered on the canyon rim, the lumen began to weep. The tears were a catharsis of overwhelming relief and stunning triumph. They turned towards the four humans, their saviors, their miracles. A chant began, their names, Ibn, Maris, Roger, Tala, repeated like a holy mantra. Ibn held up a hand, his face streaked with grime, his expression weary, his jaw set. He silenced the crowd. He then stepped aside and gestured to Sal, who stood among her slingers, their faces blackened with soot, their hands still gripping their composite slings.
This victory belongs to you,
Ibn said, his voice raw but carrying across the silence. He looked around the faces of the weavers, the engineers, the sculptors.
You had the weapon all along. We just reminded you how to use the oldest one there is. Your hands, your minds, and your home.
He looked at Sal. She met his gaze with the confidence of an equal, a commander, a hunter, a victor. Weeks later, the last of the Hessian forces had withdrawn from the Lumen system. They fled like a kicked dog. After the battle, a Lumen scout team picking through the wreckage in the ravine located Baldassar's command walker. The cockpit was smashed, but its memory core was intact. Tollin painstakingly recovered the logs, which revealed the truth. Overlord Baldassar was recalled and summarily executed for catastrophic failure and gross incompetence. His rival, Warlord Killian, publicly declared the Lumen campaign a strategically unprofitable vanity project and redirected all assets. The human involvement tipped the scales just enough to make the cost of conquest far too high. As the kindling team prepared their repaired drop pod for extraction, the final scene on the Lumen homeworld was one of peace. In a newly tilled field near the now safe city of Spirefall, Maris and Tollin worked side by side. Maris showed a group of young Lumen how to inoculate the soil with fungal and microbial cultures she brought from Earth, rebuilding their ravaged biosphere from the ground up. Tollin, his hands covered in rich, dark soil, carefully planted the first of the saved heirloom seeds into the revitalized Earth. He moved beyond preserving old culture. He was creating a new one, a culture of resilience, rooted in the hard-earned soil of survival. Sal stood on a nearby hill, watching them. A quiet, steely resolve had settled onto her features, smoothing away the gaunt lines of despair. The humans were leaving. They left behind a living, growing future, a legacy more potent than any monument, treaty, or grand declaration. A garden planted in the wreckage of a war they had taught others how to survive.